Hello and thank you for joining UK Authority Live with me, Helen Olsen-Bedford. The EU's new General Data Protection Regulation comes into force next year, ahead of Brexit. No doubt some organisations across the commercial, public and third sectors hopefully thought that GDPR might pass them by, but months ago DCMS confirmed that GDPR would indeed be adopted by the UK on schedule, on time. And last week's Queen's speech brought a commitment to create a new Data Protection Act enshrining the GDPR into UK law. So what does all this mean for the UK public sector? How do we prepare for this solid line in the data protection sand? Joining me in the studio to share their thoughts and expertise are Victoria Cetinkaya from the ICO, Senior Policy Officer, David Tidey, who's CIO of Wandsworth and Richmond Councils and Chair of the London Local CIO Council for London, and Imogen Heywood, who's Engagement Lead for the Centre of Excellence for Information Sharing, and Chris Doutney, who's Managing Director for Civica Digital. Thank you for joining me. So first things first, what I'd like to clear up is a common query that I get from our audience at UK Authority. Is there any chance that organisations in the public sector need not comply with GDPR by next May? And obviously Victoria, as from the ICO, what's the answer to that one, the definitive answer?
I'm afraid the definitive answer is that all organisations who process personal data, which will involve public authorities, will have to comply with the GDPR from the 25th of May 2018. But we think it's a bit of an opportunity, really, though, to start a new way of developing trust and confidence in the way organisations process citizens' data.
So what's the significance of last week's Queen's speech, though? Does that mean that the GDPR will be enshrined as it is in UK law, or will there be other changes to it, or do we not know yet?
Yeah, well, the GDPR is a European regulation, so it is automatically comes into force into UK law. So whatever happens, organisations will have to comply with it from the 25th of May 2018. The Queen's speech obviously included a data protection bill, which will become a Data Protection Act. And the Data Protection Act, as it will be, will clear up the areas where the GDPR leaves flexibility for member states. There are some areas such as children's data, some of the way in which the regulation will be enforced. There's some flexibility for member states to put their own take on that. That will be included in the Data Protection Bill, as will law enforcement, because law enforcement is not included in the GDPR. It has a separate directive.
Okay, so how ready do we think the public sector is for this? We had a survey, our own survey at the beginning of the year, which did suggest that 76%, three-quarters were working on GDPR at the beginning of the year. But actually, we're going to just put a poll up for the audience. If we could put our first poll up, is your organisation ready for the introduction of GDPR next May? Yes, 100% and ready and rolling to go with it. Working on it, not yet started, but confident you will be ready. Or not started and slightly worried about being ready. Let us know and feed that back to us. We'll bring you back in on that. Also, if you have any questions you'd like to put to the panel, please use the instant messenger facility that's on your screen now. Thank you very much. So, Chris, let's come to you first. So with your customers and your clients across the public sector, is this an issue with them, GDPR? Are they ready? Are they asking about it?
They're certainly aware of it as an initiative. Whether they're all fully ready is a different question. And my suspicion is that they're in the preparatory stage in most cases. We also have private sector clients and charitable clients. Most of them, I think, are less aware. I think there's less awareness across the private sector and charities, and less awareness of what they need to do. Public sector does respond quite well to compliance and legislative initiatives in general. So I think public sector is alert, but probably now needs to start road mapping what the next steps are and how they get control over their data collection system, so they can demonstrate that control, which is the fundamental thing really with GDPR.
It's quite nice to hear that the public sector is a bit ahead of other sectors when it comes to something that's related to this. David, what's the situation like at Richmond and Wandsworth?
I think we're in the midst of preparing for the GDPR. So I would say across London, lots of local authorities are concerned about it. I've got projects and plans in place to become compliant. I suspect most people think they won't be 100% by next May, but they will be it will be a work in progress. And the key is to prioritise the important things so that come May, you're ready to hit the ground running.
But Imogen, from the Centre of Excellence for Information Sharing, I mean, your remit is to help councils share information across sectors, I believe, as well. So how does that impact the GDPR? How does that impact the will to share?
So with the GDPR coming in, one of the things that we're noticing is that local authorities, not just councils, but obviously police, fire and NHS, as well, are starting to think not only getting themselves ready for GDPR, but also how they can support their partners to become ready to comply with GDPR, particularly the voluntary community sector, who are playing a really crucial role these days in delivering public services. I know, for example, we have in Essex a group there that are working very hard to make sure that they're supporting their voluntary and community sector to become GDPR aware and GDPR ready, so that they can both act on behalf of the authority in delivering services and managing the data that goes with that service delivery.
What's the biggest shift, though? Because, I mean, there's been a number of comments about getting ready, preparing the data collection. So what is the biggest shift from the Data Protection Act and the requirement on GDPR that they have to accommodate?
That's an interesting question. I think certainly the GDPR builds on the Data Protection Act principles as they are now. However, we think a really big shift is going to be in the new principle for accountability. And what that basically is going to mean for organisations is that they're going to have to demonstrate how they comply with the GDPR. So it's not just about complying, it's about having processes and procedures in place to show you comply. It's about doing privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments, as they're known in the GDPR, to make sure that projects and programmes that you're starting to work on have got privacy built in from the beginning, and that they enable compliance as they go on. So I think that's going to be a real change in terms of just the general demonstrating how compliance happens.
I think so. There are two major differences. I think, in addition, one is cultural, which we're kind of portraying it as data's not yours as an organisation because somebody's let you use it. It's on loan from that person. So that I think will be a cultural change that people probably haven't got their minds around who've used data over the years. But the other thing, of course, is the material scale of the fines, because the fines will be 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever's the larger. So if you take an example, TalkTalk had some problems last year for which they were fined £400,000. That could be £70 million going forward.
That's crippling, isn't it?
And that applies
whether
you're public, private.
Sector? Would they get such a level of fine from the ICO?
Well, obviously the maximum fine for the public sector would be the 20 million euros. However, how we will enforce is still yet to be seen, and obviously we will intend to continue being a proportionate regulator wherever we can in terms of where breaches happen, looking at the seriousness, the harm, the distress that's caused from those breaches, and obviously the steps that organisations have taken to try and mitigate the risks that cause the breaches in the first place. So while obviously there's still detail yet to be set out in terms of whether there will be any further limits on what public authorities will have to pay as enforcement fines should they incur them, we would always aim to be proportionate in the way that we regulate.
You mentioned culture, which I thought was an interesting issue, in that, you know, we generally talk about technology on UK authority, but the cultural change is becoming more and more important in terms of delivering the benefits of any technology programme. But the Centre of Excellence for Information Sharing, Imogen, you deal a lot with the culture to begin with in encouraging people to share. Would you agree with Chris that there's a big cultural element to the GDPR?
Absolutely, and it's really reassuring for me to hear Chris mentioning that cultural element. And as you've mentioned, the Centre of Excellence for Information Sharing, our focus is on the cultural aspects of information sharing, because as important as the technology and the legal compliance is, you also have to have people's trust and confidence, and to have the relationships that enable those systems and processes to work. And I think Chris is right. There's going to be a cultural shift, not only in how the GDPR impacts on our relationships as organisations and how we work together and share information, but also it has the potential to drive a change in our culture and our relationships with the public. As Chris talked about, the data being on loan, from the people whose data it is, rather than organisations seeing the data as ours. And I think it's really interesting, the potential for some of the new rights within the GDPR to change that dynamic. So, the right to be forgotten and the right to know where your data has come from have the potential to shift those relationships. So we have examples at the moment where we have agencies sharing information to support safeguarding, and that's done in a confidential way, and then used to support the delivery of services. But if somebody now has the potential to ask, where did you get that information from that tells you I'm at risk or in need of this service? It could create worries for the agencies that are sharing the data, that being identified as providing data could perhaps change people's perceptions of them, particularly when they have trusted relationships, so youth workers or doctors and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
I mean, one of the topics I did want to bring up today was around culture, but also the culture from the citizen's point of view. Do you think the citizen understands current data protection and GDPR and this consent issue? Because, I mean, the consent around working with, say, troubled families that's very personal data. That definitely falls under GDPR. What trumps what? What rights?
I would say that for those very personal services, normally consent is handled quite well because it's a one-to-one explanation with the family. I think the general citizens aren't probably that aware of data protection, and I don't think they're that aware yet of GDPR and what extra rights it will give them, which we're all, slightly unsure of, and how we're going to respond to them. If someone says, I want to be forgotten by your organisation, there's probably going to be a conversation which says, we can forget some things, but there are others. We provide services to you. We have to still keep your information and process it. So there's going to be an interesting dialogue there with them.
Victoria, that's I mean, also, what about in the case of fraud, for example? If they want their data forgotten, but actually,
absolutely.
Where do they draw that line?
Yeah, I think it's important to state that the right to be forgotten, or as it's written in the GDPR, the right to erasure, is actually that it's limited. That there are limitations to it. So, for example, if a public authority is processing someone's personal data for the purposes of their public task, for carrying out their public task, so for prevention, for providing services, then that right falls away, and there's no ability for the citizen to require data to be forgotten that really shouldn't be forgotten, if you like. But I think one right that's really important in terms of raising general awareness amongst the population is the right to be informed, and that's one that I think will affect organisations quite significantly, in that under the Data Protection Act as is now, organisations have to be transparent to a certain extent and tell people what data they're processing about them. That right to be informed is strengthened in the GDPR, and there's a lot of emphasis on being clear and accessible and transparent, and making sure that people really understand and are aware of what data you're processing, where you got it from, who you share it with. So that hopefully will assist.
So unfortunately, our bland statements about we'll share your data to provide your services won't be good enough anymore. We'll have to be a lot more explicit about how we collect and share and use data.
Absolutely.
And time-bounded as well, I believe.
Yeah. And that's a big challenge. I think we're talking about culture. I think one of the issues is going to be getting senior management in organisations aware that this is coming along. At the moment, most know about it, but really aren't aware of the full implications of it and how it's going to change the way organisations work and handle data.
Feeding back the poll results, at the moment we have 2% say that they are ready, 100% ready and ready to roll, which is amazing and brilliant, well done. 76% are working on it and are confident that they will be ready. 4% are not yet started, but are confident that they will be ready. And 17% are not yet started and worried about being ready. And that's quite, I thank you for your honesty, folks. And there's a number of comments that have come in alongside that, which I think we might bring in now. Sue says, we're desperately working on it, but desperately in need of ICO guidance in order to properly become confident of compliance, which is a good point because, for example, the time limits,
Yep.
we don't know what they are yet. So it's difficult to plan for those. And, when will those decisions be made?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've produced a significant amount of guidance, as is at the moment, on our website, ico.org.uk. You'll find the 12 steps to comply. You'll find the overview to the GDPR, which has got various strands of guidance now coming off from it. Our consent guidance is in draft at the moment and nearly ready to go. But you're right, there's a lot of guidance that we are still to do and will do. Some of that we're working on now. Some of that we do have to wait for decisions from government, because the way the GDPR works is it sets out the framework, and then there are member state decisions and flexibilities that can be built in, and obviously the Data Protection Bill will assist with those, but some of those decisions have to be made before we can then go on to write the guidance. There's also an EU level of guidance as well in certain areas, so again we're waiting for some of that too.
Doreen Todd is asking if there's going to be specific guidance for, say, health and social care, or would the IG toolkit be a way of evidencing compliance for NHS organisations? Will there be specific for the sectors, do you think?
At the moment, we don't do sector-specific guidance. We tend to keep it it's fairly sector neutral, although we do try and give sectoral examples within our guidance to assist. In terms of the IG toolkit, I understand that's been reviewed at the moment, and obviously it will remain to be seen as to how that's reviewed, as to whether that will assist in GDPR compliance. And certainly what we would say is it's important to be clear from the top that as to whether that IG toolkit is going to be good enough to evidence compliance, or if it will just be one part of wider evidence.
I've got a question actually. Turning back to suppliers, actually, Christine Higgins has got a very good question here. Chris, do Civica believe that they and other software providers are going to be ready to help local authorities in their preparation for GDPR? For example, data cleansing activities, are they going to charge us for such services? I mean, this is a genuine concern out there. Will software be ready? Is it going to cost them?
So in Civica Digital, we're working with 500 organisations globally, mostly within the UK, but globally. We have a series of offerings already in this space, which many of which have actually tied into things that we already do. So we do GDPR awareness sessions with people on a kind of complementary basis to get people up to speed and understand what they need to do. We then do detailed readiness assessments and roadmaps of the kind of tasks they need to do. But that ties into something we've done a lot of work with our clients on, which is single view of customer. And I guess our view is most local authorities, and indeed most organisations, store data about people in different silos across the organisation. If you do that, you don't necessarily know what you're holding about people, so you're not sure what personal information you're holding. If you can get a single view of all data you have in relation to your customers, you're in a much better position then to determine, to put controls around it, which is what GDPR is all about, to demonstrate that you've got controls around it, you've got risk mitigations in place. So we're doing a lot of that, and we're also working with a partner called My Life Digital, who've developed a platform which enables you to then manage consents in quite a detailed, sophisticated way, because you often want to ask for a series of consents, or people might want to give you consent for certain things but not others, and so you can actually break it down into quite a detailed way going forward. So we've got all that kind of capability, and we're working with a number of clients across the piece to work on that.
Is that approach sensible? I mean,
I hope so.
Oh no, I'm sure it sounds sensible, but I'm just thinking of historically, if you've got a lot of legacy information. I mean, if you're working with, say, groups across public sector organisation, different parts of the public sector, you can't bring all that information into one store. And in a local authority, you might have, dozens of databases holding different information. And do we have the consent in place to pull that into one? Who would I?
Well,
David,
okay,
and then I'll come back to you,
okay.
Chris.
So I would say suppliers are a bit mixed. Some are thinking about it now, and of course they actually have a lot more responsibility under GDPR than they do in the past. So they have to take responsibility, and they have to.
The suppliers do.
The suppliers do, and they have
That's
to
good.
potentially change their systems and the way they process data, etc., to be compliant themselves. Some are thinking about it, but I suspect some won't. We will have to push them to do that. But the key issue, as you say, bringing all the data together into one system. What consent was given, and we won't have necessarily a track back to the consent that was given when the data was given to us 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. We will know roughly that they may have given it, but not exactly what that consent was. And I'm not sure we're clear about whether we need to go back and ask for consent again.
Victoria?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yes, certainly what we've said as part of the very early preparations, we've suggested that organisations do an information asset audit. So find out what you've got, and then crucially, not just what you've got and where it is, but also on what basis are you holding it? Are you holding it because the people gave you consent to do certain things with it? Or actually are you holding it because of your public task or just generally to provide services, in which case you may not have needed consent in the first place and all you needed was to inform people that this is what you've got their data for and this is what you do. So that's why it's really important for authorities to bottom out on what basis they're holding the data, and where they do have consent, it will be important to review that consent, because the consent, the standard of consent in GDPR is higher than the standard of consent under the Data Protection Act. And if you're holding data on the basis of consent, come the 25th of May 2018, that consent will have to be GDPR level consent. So it's very important to know whether it was consent in the first place, and if it was, to review it.
Imogen, how does that feel to you? Because, I mean, that does sound like quite a big task. I mean, yes, the suppliers like Civica may well be there and ready with solutions, and absolutely, it would be wonderful to have all that data in one place and managed and with all the consent and everything around it. But that's not where much of the public sector is. And with 400 local authorities, do they all have to individually bottom out their consent?
I think stepping back from the specific consent question in terms of how this feels in terms of the introduction of the GDPR and potentially a big task. One of the things that we have as a worry at the centre is we've had quite a positive shift over the last few years of data sharing being seen as a positive thing and something that people are proactively looking to enable. The Data Protection Act, despite its name with the focus on protection, was put in place to support appropriate and legal sharing of information. It wasn't necessarily put in place as let's stop sharing. And GDPR follows that model. But again, general data protection regulations, the name and the potential reaction that we have to new legislation, let's step back, let's stop, let's not, it's perhaps too complicated or too difficult. There is a worry for us that it could recreate that culture of fear and it's too hard. Legislation says no, so we're just not going to try. So we're really keen to encourage public authorities and the public as a whole to see GDPR as an opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, and as an enabler of the better design of public services, to give better experience for the recipients of those services, better outcomes. And I think it's really important that, as Chris said, we don't look at this as just a problem for the information governance team or the information management team. It is something that's looked at by public authorities across their whole organisation. Yep. So the cultural change and the mapping of the information assets should be seen as an opportunity to look across the organisation and bring people together to better understand the data they hold and what that means in terms of the relationships that they're going to have with other organisations and with the public.
That sounds like a good point at the moment to put up our second poll, which actually is, will the GDPR help your organisation share information to improve the efficiency and quality of the services you and other public sector organisations provide? So as Imogen's suggesting, is it an opportunity? Do you think it yes, somewhat, or no? Let us know. And any comments on GDPR, helping to share information for better public services in a world of big data?
I think it will make the organisation more aware of the data it's got. So hopefully it will be a positive thing. I would say we are still quite siloed in many local authorities, so this should open up that information that we already hold. But I agree. We need to be clear that sharing information is not necessarily a bad thing. Local authorities don't share information just for the sake of it. We're doing it because we want to help people deliver services to them. I suspect that possibly the ICO will be looking more at some of the commercial sector, which maybe has got slightly more dodgy practices.
I couldn't possibly comment. Victoria.
I think the GDPR done well is really an opportunity to give organisations the confidence to share data when it's legitimate and justified and proportionate to do so, to provide really good public services, for example. And to do that in a way that's transparent, so that citizens know what organisations are doing with their data, and therefore to really engender trust between the organisation and the citizen. So I think with good governance and good compliance within organisations in terms of doing data protection impact assessments, for example, when setting up programmes to improve public services, that can give the organisation the confidence to share data and to be transparent and tell people, hey, this is what we're doing with your data, and this is a really good thing, this is why we're doing it, and this is what we're doing to protect your privacy while we do it. And that really should develop that confidence and trust.
I've got a question that's come in on this part, which actually is probably best for David and Imogen on this one. Is how does the panel feel about authorities that are going through alternative service delivery strategies with local authorities joining forces, as your CIO for 2 councils, systems and resources and working with the third sector, etc., where GDPR might just be another project that they haven't got the resources for, because obviously this is going to cost in time and possibly charges from suppliers. How does that fit with the mix? Let's break that down into councils who are working together. So yes, how do we put their data together?
Well, I think councils who are working together, it's not necessarily going to be about let's put all our data together, because the systems and the ways we have of managing data at the moment don't necessarily rely on all the data being pooled. There are ways for data sharing to take place without the actual creation of one mass data warehouse.
Federated approaches.
Yes, federated approaches, absolutely. And I know a lot of areas are looking at those federated approaches. Greater Manchester is one area in particular where they're looking at that. And I think it's going to be more about looking at the relationships and the understanding that the authorities have about their own data, and then comparing notes and sharing that understanding, because it's quite likely that data about one individual will be held by more than one organisation. But as mentioned earlier, it's about the purpose for which you've got that data, and making sure that there's a clear understanding as to why that data is there and the benefits for which it's being used. And I think one of the real opportunities and key focus points that authorities should be looking at in terms of working together is how they're communicating about GDPR and the data that they hold and the data that they share with the public and with each other, so that there is consistent messages going out, because it is a confusing landscape potentially. And if we have every local authority, every NHS trust, every police and fire authority sending out slightly different messages to the public, we could add to that confusion, when really we could be working together to look at being consistent in our messages around GDPR and information sharing. And I think also there's a potential for a really interesting debate, not just about how do we communicate and help people understand information sharing, but how do we communicate about the benefits of sharing information? Because both in GDPR and in the Digital Economy Act, there's a real emphasis on the need to show public interest as a reason for sharing the data, or individual or household benefit from sharing data. But these terms are quite undefined, and it's going to be interesting to see how decisions are made and how people work out what's meant by that kind of public benefit, public interest.
I'd like to come back to that in a second. I'm going to bring in the results from the poll. Will GDPR help with information sharing? 32% say yes, 45% somewhat, 21% say no. So, and some of the questions that we've been coming in, Alex is asking, do we yet know when the new Data Protection Act will be ready? It's difficult to plan in the absence of detail. And I have a certain sympathy for that, actually. And also, is there a danger that incorrect assumptions that they make may mean that they're actually not compliant by next May, even with the best of intentions? So, Victoria, I think that one might.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there is a legislative timetable that's going to have to be gone through with the new Data Protection Act. We'd hope to see a draft bill towards the end of the summer. We'd hope, obviously, out for consultation, which authorities should make sure that they look at and respond accordingly. And then obviously it will be down to governmental timetable in terms of getting the Act in place. Yes, there is some detail that's not clear at the moment, but I think probably the important thing is just to keep aware. You can sign up to the ICO's e-newsletter and we'll tell you what we know on a regular monthly basis, so that there are ways and means of getting a flavour as to where the direction of travel is going.
But in the absence of that bill at the moment, I mean, people could start working on the obvious basis of, find out what information you hold that is personal data, why you hold it, and where you hold it. And that's a very good starting point that they should be doing now anyway. I mean, people who are compliant with DPA in the first place are probably, off to a good starting point, I would have thought, in any case for GDPR.
That's right, yes.
But there's still a lot of people who are maybe not so compliant.
That's right. I mean, certainly that's what we've been emphasising for many months now, that actually in the absence of detail, the Data Protection Act, make sure that you're complying with the principles well, and then move on to look at our 12 steps and look at the areas that you're going to have to look at. And as you say, the information asset audit is a pretty big job for organisations that hold a lot of personal data. So actually, make sure you've really bottomed that out, and the detail will be coming through as you're working on those things.
We've had a number of questions that have mentioned something that you mentioned earlier, actually, Imogen, the Digital Economy Act, which came into being just before the election. And within that, particularly the section that talks about presumption of data sharing for the improvement in delivery in public services and the prevention of fraud. Is there a conflict there, do you think, between the GDPR's control in the hands of the citizen through to, actually, if we decide it's for improving services, we can override that?
I don't think it's necessarily a conflict. I think you're absolutely right. There's a different focus of the two. So GDPR is very much about empowering the citizen, empowering the individual, whereas the Digital Economy Act has looked at supporting and empowering local authorities, public authorities, to share data for specific purposes. Whether that's around fuel poverty or tackling fraud. So I think it's looking at the same things from two slightly different perspectives, but I don't necessarily think means that they conflict with each other. Reassuringly, there's a very clear focus in both around transparency, and in GDPR, it's one of the key things of this requirement to really inform people about the sharing that's happening. And there will be a code of practice being developed around transparency as part of the development of the Digital Economy Act. And that's going to be a key part of how that act is put into place and implemented. And I think this is where the two pieces of legislation can complement each other, and with that focus on improved transparency, both of not just what data is being shared and how it's being shared, but the why it's being shared, coming back to that purpose and the benefits. It's going to be interesting to see how who and how those decisions are made about whether it's for the public benefit or it supports the delivery of public services. I think there's a real opportunity here for privacy by design, the use of privacy impact assessments to play a great role in that. And it's in the current guidance, the ICO talks about the need for not just internal consultation to help you develop and work out what are the privacy impacts, but also external consultation. So talking to the people who will be affected by the sharing of data and whose data it is you might be sharing. And that's an opportunity not just to get them involved in the co-design of your privacy controls or your services, but also to have that debate about, is this in the public interest? I think there's maybe tensions between whether it's an individual's benefit, public interest, or that wider public good, particularly around the fraud issue.
One. Yes.
But I think we need to have some mature and healthy debate around this.
David, what's the view across the London? Because there's the London CIO Council. They're involved in the London Fraud Hub, for example. Yep. And what's the view there? I mean, does the Digital Economy Act help you share this information?
To be honest, I think for fraud, prevention of fraud, we've probably got the legislative background already to deal with that. We tend not to have any issues around sharing that information. And it's in our privacy statements that's what we would do. I mean, I probably will go further and say that particularly where you're dealing with healthcare, there should be deemed consent if it can be shown to be the interests of the individual, which is probably controversial. But I've seen so many organisations where there is a spaghetti of information sharing agreements and it's really very unclear to the individual who's sharing what for what reason. So I personally think we should be enshrining that if it's in interest of an individual, that data should be shared between parties that are relevant to that case of that person. That may be a bit controversial.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, for example, the Digital Economy Act is there, it is in law. One would assume that in the case of, say, a disaster like Grenfell Tower, dreadful situation, but the law surely there would enable people to pool their information around people. Whereas actually we had a situation where, a team came to talk about benefits, a team came to talk about health, and not treating the person as a person holistically, joining up that information. But surely the law would allow that to happen, Victoria, at the moment in terms of the Digital Economy Act.
Well, the law usually does allow for proportionate and justified data sharing. So that's the usual basis from which you're starting. In terms of the Digital Economy Act, the detail's going to be in the codes of practice. And those codes of practice, we've put quite a lot of views forward on what should be in those in terms of clarity and in terms of consistency with GDPR, so that understanding can be there in the public sector as to where you are with data sharing, whether you can do it or not, because that's always the big question. And what the one thing that we have secured in the codes of practice is the need to have regard to our codes of practice on privacy impact assessments, on data sharing and on privacy notices. So again, it's that whole sort of transparency and working out from the outset the privacy risks and how to mitigate them. And obviously in cases of severe emergency, then the weighting of the risk against the benefit of the data sharing will often come out favourably.
Chris?
Which makes absolute sense. I mean, I think it's quite interesting, actually, tying back to what Imogen was saying earlier. I think there hasn't been a big public debate about the benefits of information sharing, other than at quite a superficial level. I mean, years and years ago, there was this talk about what became Tell Us Once. You have a terrible life event, somebody passes away, you don't want to tell 7 or 8 different organisations about it. So that initiative kind of got underway, but took years to get there. It would be terrible to roll those things back as a result of GDPR, but also at the same time, they haven't moved on as much as they could have because nobody's had the public debate. And meanwhile, out in the private sector world, you've got kind of information giants which are kind of taking information, manipulating it, analysing it, and coming back with recommendations for you on a daily basis. And everybody kind of takes that as read now, via their mobile phone. But here, where it would be, where there are obvious benefits, particularly in an age of austerity, where we're all looking to try and streamline how public services are delivered, it just seems kind of mad that the debate hasn't been had.
Hold that thought. I've just had a couple of questions asking about the outcome of the second poll. To repeat it, its updated answers are 28% yes, that GDPR will help, 53% somewhat, and 17% no. So it's going down as we're talking, which is very good. I'm just putting up a third poll, which is asking the same question about the Digital Economy Act. So from the conversation around that, do you think that the Digital Economy Act will help you share? Now, what I'd like to move back to now is this debate with the citizen, because yes, people splurge their intimate details across social media, and that data is owned by social media giants, not by the citizen. And yet at the same time, we're not happy with our data being shared necessarily across public services for our benefit. There's a bit of a paradox going on there. I mean, any thoughts on that, on why there is that difference? Victoria?
In terms of why there's that difference, I'm not sure, but I think certainly what the GDPR will do to assist that situation somewhat is going back to the right to be forgotten, or the right to erasure, if you like, as it's called. That right will apply in those situations where people have thrown way too much information than they actually meant to in the first place on social media. And that's the sort of thing that will be addressed by that part of the GDPR. So that will perhaps redress the balance slightly. And then in terms of the use of data for public services, again, it's all back to why do you want to do it? What are your purposes? What are the privacy risks? How are you going to mitigate those? And can you do it, in terms of doing a privacy impact assessment and then being really transparent? One thing that we find organisations don't always do so well in terms of the privacy impact assessment is actually consulting with the external people, that is the citizens themselves and the representative bodies of citizens. So that's probably an area which could assist in
I've had a couple
balancing
of
that
questions
out.
about the privacy impact statement. Sorry, I'm trying to take as many of these questions as possible, but there's a lot coming in. A couple of comments, similar questions around the privacy impact assessment. Can you define what that is? Because that seems to be something that's quite new to people.
Well, we've got some guidance on our website and have done for a couple of years now. So go to our website and look and search for privacy impact assessment, and you'll find some guidance that tells you how to do it. All it is, it's basically a risk assessment. It's basically saying, what do we want to do? What's the purpose? What are the risks? How can we mitigate those risks? And then taking a decision as to, well, okay, bearing in mind all of that, can we do it as we want to? Are we going to have to put some extra safeguards in? Or is it going to be something that actually is a step too far and is not going to be an acceptable way of processing people's data? And
going back to the citizen and getting them to help, there's a very interesting question come through from Pin Bandal. Health services are looking to provide patient care as a whole, irrespective if it's a hospital, community services, social services, GP practices, mental health trusts. I'm talking about the STPs, Sustainable Transformation Plans. And how will GDPR affect this new working and interoperability? And I wanted to put that question within the context of getting people to understand information campaigns and remind everyone of the care.data fiasco, which wasn't handled very well, and there was a genuine benefit for sharing that data. What did we not get right over that, and can GDPR help us navigate around that? Imogen?
In terms of care.data, it has left a big legacy in terms of how the media and the public respond to stories about information sharing. And it is something that's still creating difficulties in the health sector where they're looking at developing local data sharing schemes. But I wanted to mention some great work that's happening in the North East through the Connected Health Cities programme, where as part of the development of the Great North Care Record, which is designed to support exactly what the person who sent the question was talking about, the provision of care across all different types of the health sector. And in due course social care. They are starting a programme of engagement with local citizens, with local people, to get their input into shaping the privacy controls and the privacy settings and the privacy information that they're developing around the Great North Care Record, so that it can make sure that it's not just created and given to people to say, right, you have to use this device to tell us your options. But they're involved in shaping it, not just the content, but also the language and the way it's described and the words that are used, so that there's a real clear sense of shared understanding, which is really important from a sort of accountability GDPR perspective, where you've got to be able to demonstrate not that you just got consent, but that person really understood what it was they were consenting to. So I think this is what it would be great to see more happening around, in terms of whether it's NHS authorities or councils coming together and having these conversations with the citizen. Because I think without these conversations, we're not going to be able to move past the legacy of things like care.data, where it was clear communication was poor, and this was part of the reasons it went wrong.
I mean, the views of the two, a CIO, technology, and also a technology supplier, would you agree with that? That, it sounds like it's not, although the technology is the enabler for sharing this information and working smarter, etc., it's a behavioural change and culture that we require, not just from the public sector, but from the citizen. And that's going to be a challenge, perhaps.
Do you want to go
David,
first?
you go first.
I absolutely agree. I think we were talking earlier about social media, and I think people just give their information. Maybe it's a generational thing, but when I see an advert for something that I was thinking about a few weeks ago, I find it creepy. But we don't do that in the public sector. We are genuinely only sharing information for the good of the citizen or the customer. So I think it is about us trying to communicate and not be seen as Big Brother. I think people do think the state is somehow against them, but we're not. We are there to serve the citizen.
I think absolutely. I think technology offers the opportunity to. It's kind of a hygiene factor. So if you've got it and you've got it working right, then actually what you can do is you can demonstrate that you've managed the data, you've put in place the risk mitigations, you've got audit trails. Hopefully in the current world you've got firewalls around it so it's protected from external attack, and if people start attacking you, monitoring it so you know it's being attacked, all of those kind of things. If you've got disparate kind of systems, and I mean we've all seen organisations that have Excel spreadsheets full of names and address information, all that kind of stuff, you just don't know where you are. So my argument would be you kind of use technology as a hygiene factor to enable you to get a proper view of what you've got, and it's either no more or no less than that. Beyond that, then you've got all the capability of modern data analytics that allows you to do amazing things, but you've got to inform people you're going to do it, and you've got to pseudonymise the data or anonymise the data, and all of that kind of stuff, which will allow you to improve services. So we don't want to throw that baby out with the bathwater, I would suggest. But it is about culture and adult kind of responsible behaviour of how you're handling this data that's not yours. I go back to it's on loan from other people. Use the technologies to make sure you do it properly.
Do you think that's a sensible approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, there is also a requirement in the GDPR, the data minimisation principle, which was again it showed up in the Data Protection Act as well as under a different name. But it's about working out having clear purpose, and then deciding what data is necessary to fulfil those purposes, and then processing that data accordingly. And and as I've said already, doing the privacy impact assessments where appropriate, and keeping the citizen engaged with what you're doing, and consulting where appropriate, and telling them what you're doing.
I've just got the results back from poll 3. So on the Digital Economy Act, 22% say yes, it'll help with information sharing, 68% somewhat, 9% no. So slightly different, more think somewhat than the GDPR. I'm just going to put up a final poll 4, which is, guess what, it's about the two of them together. Do you think that the GDPR and the Digital Economy Act work well together? Let us have your thoughts. There's a lot of more questions coming up that I can't take at the moment, asking for more information about things such as, web references for the Digital Economy Act, information about the cities, the connected health cities.
Yeah,
so if we can,
Health Cities website, I can absolutely give you a link.
Brilliant. So we'll collate all those questions and make all the answers available from the panel afterwards. That'll be in the next few days. A lot of questions on timing are coming up. There's a lot of coming back to the confusion of not having clarity on some of the. There isn't a. This is what you do. You tick the box. It'll be okay. A lot of things are still not decided. I can assume, can we, that the new Data Protection Act will come in the next 2 years parliamentary session? It will have to. That's what the plan is.
It should do, because
So-
it's needed to implement certain parts of the GDPR where the member states have flexibility. So where the UK is allowed to make their own decision on a certain part of GDPR, the new Data Protection Act will put that into law. So yes, it will be needed. So it'll have to be pretty quick.
So you're going to hit the ground running on that one. There's no breathing space.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll wait for the bill. When the bill's drafted, we'll have a look at it. We'll comment accordingly, and as soon as we get some clarity as to where that will be, then obviously we'll incorporate relevant parts into our guidance.
There's been a lot of questions during the session that have been asking about the costs. Obviously, the costs of our suppliers going to charge more. I mean, obviously, anything that takes time, whether it's by the time of the public sector or the time of the commercial sector, that has a cost to it. Do we have any idea of how much it might cost an organisation, or what the investment in time required is? Chris, let's start with you on that one.
Oh, thank you very much, Helen. I couldn't put a hard and fast number on it. I mean, it's a substantial amount of work.
But it's work for your teams as well, isn't it? It's not something that you can just go, here's the answer. No,
we're gearing up at the moment to build an extra line of capability to be able to handle it, because we think it will be a genuinely heavy amount of work for us. We've got the front end that can help on the advisory stuff around, telling you what it's about, working your roadmap through. We've got capability already around identifying, kind of a single view of your citizen or your customer base. So we've got that, but it's then the kind of people hours that are required to go and do that customer by customer. So it's potentially a big effort. But as I said earlier, if you're already data compliant, you're probably okay. You're probably well on the path, I would suggest. It's more people who know at the moment in their hand on heart they're not really there already for data protection. They're the ones who will be having to do a lot more now, I would suggest.
David, what's your view from?
Well, I would suggest that most local authorities will probably have a couple of people working on this pretty much full time, over the next year or so.
Yep.
But those people will need to engage with a lot of people in the organisation, all of the system owners, all of the data owners, to carry out these assessments, etc. So the overall cost of the organisation is quite high if you added it all up, but you really do need a focus of a couple of people who are going to drive this through. And then, of course, we haven't spoken about the role of the Data Protection Officer, which is a new role under the Act.
Funnily enough, there's a number of questions come up about the responsibility.
And he's very different from what would normally be called the current Data Protection Officer. It's much more of a sort of an audit role that is reporting straight up to the board or to the chief exec. Right. So you've got to think about where that's going to fit in the organisation. I'm not sure everyone has really bottomed out where the best place to place that is in the organisation.
Victoria, Imogen, what are your thoughts on where that role sits?
I was wanting to come in not so much on the role of the Data Protection Officer specifically, but the comment that David made earlier about whilst there might be one or two people who are given a task of getting an organisation GDPR compliant, it needs to be viewed as organisational change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it won't just be the system owners and the data holders that they'll have to be talking to. They'll also need to be talking to their organisational development training teams, to the communications teams, and particularly to the senior management teams, because there's going to be absolutely crucial that there is really strong leadership, direction and support for GDPR compliance to be possible. And I think that's where the Data Protection Officer and that link comes in. As a centre, we've always highlighted the role of leadership in helping tackle particularly the cultural barriers that there can be around information sharing. And I think that the GDPR, the move towards GDPR compliance makes that even more important. And also, again, the communications side of things is going to become increasingly important. And we're, as a centre, looking at doing some work with some of the communications groups to support communications teams to better understand what are some of the myths and legends that exist around information governance and how they can support that push towards transparency and open dialogue, particularly with the citizen, around information sharing.
I mean, it does feel as though the GDPR and the Digital Economy Act have raised the game significantly in the data and the privacy concerns in this whole arena. And it's an interesting question as to who should take responsibility. Is it at a personal level, i.e. the data protection officer, or is it a collective responsibility, or is it that the CEO, the chief executive and the lead member take the responsibility? What are your thoughts on that? David?
It really needs to be the chief executive and the board that needs to take responsibility. Obviously, the CIO has a role in that, who's almost certainly sitting on the board.
Yeah.
But when the fines roll in, they're the ones who are going to be sitting there trying to.
It's interesting that the fines could give attention and drive the leadership that's required. Yes. Victoria?
Yeah, I think certainly we've been trying to press the message for some time now that data protection is a boardroom issue. It needs to be a boardroom issue. Obviously, it should be now, but the increased fines under GDPR and the fact that organisations are going to have to spend some resource, whether that be a data protection officer and people working on projects now to get data protection ingrained in through the organisation. So it's really important that top level are really aware and really clear and committed to getting their organisations compliant, because the whole organisation is going to have to demonstrate their compliance.
Chris, what's your feeling on that?
Totally agree with all of that. I mean, it goes right to the top, and you can't just kind of segment it down to the DPO and that poor character is all to blame for everything that goes right. It won't work like that. So it needs to be right at the top.
Do you think, from what you're seeing at the moment, this is a question to all of you, do you think that leadership and that commitment and understanding is there at the top today, or is there work to do?
I think it varies across the piece. There are some authorities where there are people at the senior level championing GDPR compliance and information sharing more generally, but it is a mixed picture, I think. And it's going to be really important for those people who are championing in their local area to also look at the potential for them to help their neighbouring authorities and their neighbouring chief executives, or so things like the CIO networks and chief executive networks, heads of ADAS and so on, where you're looking at directors of social services. They've got a really important role to play. Whilst information sharing might not be a fundamental part of their departmental focus or their policy focus, it's going to be really important in their leadership role that they start to support each other through those peer networks around this issue.
Yeah, that's something we're launching in London, a sort of self-help therapy group to try and
like the idea of that.
share best practice. And, let's draft one model privacy policy and share it amongst all the
It does
authorities.
seem sensible to have one model. And who should provide that? The ICO, the LGA, Socketim, Solace, ADAS? As you say, it's quite a complex picture, isn't it? Chris, Imogen? Chris?
I haven't got a view, but it needs to be kind of worked through with you guys and ICO, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can give the broad high level guidance in terms of the actual templates and the actual processes, and I think they need to be worked through at sectoral level, because you know what data you've got and you know what you want to do with that data. So while we don't give templates in that sense, but we have seen some good practice going on. We've seen some organisations on a regional basis trying to get information asset audit checklists together, things like that. So that work is happening, and that's really positive.
I wanted to add to that. I think, as well as things being worked through at a sectoral level, I think it's really important that whilst templates and sort of example policies and documents can be really helpful, that public authorities don't give in to the temptation to just say, oh, we'll just change where it says Chelsea to Northampton, because you're then missing the crucial part of the process of creating these documents. It's not writing it, it's having the discussion, having the debate, having that consultation before you document it. That's the really crucial bit, because that's where that sense of trust and ownership and the relationships are built in the conversations, in the consultation. So if you're wanting to make sure you're being transparent and you're creating that trust and relationship, whether it's with partner organisations or with the citizen, if you're coming along with a template where you've just changed the names and you don't really understand it or believe in it or have talked about it before, you're going to create more headaches for yourself. I think they're really valuable in giving you a starting point, but they shouldn't be kind of blanketly applied without too much consideration for your local circumstances and your local conditions and things you need to take account of.
Absolutely, because we talked about it being a cultural change, and actually if you get something from a peak body and your specialist in data protection says, yeah, that's good, and you drop it into the organisation, the people at the front line who deal with the citizen every day haven't had their culture changed at all. They've just got a new form that's come from somebody. So you need to roll that through.
One of the big pieces of work is informing all of your staff about what this means,
exactly.
how they've got to behave differently. And just a lot of the data losses we have are manual files. It's not electronic stuff, and it's about people being careless.
That's a very good point.
That's what you fear, is someone's going to lose a child's file on a bus, and that's the thing that keeps you awake at night.
Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time. I'm just going to bring back the last poll questions. The poll answer: will the GDPR and Digital Economy Act conflict or complement? Complement 5%, minor conflict 85%, major conflict 10%. So I guess everyone's looking for more guidance on that. We'll include links to information at in the next few days or in the follow-up, and we'll try and handle as many of the questions that we couldn't take, I'm afraid. I just want to run past with you some practical final closing comments. What should public sector organisations be doing between now and 25th of May? What's the best thing that they should be doing? And I'm going to go around this way, so I'm going to start with you, Chris.
So the very first thing they should do is work out what personal data they hold, on what grounds they hold it, where they hold it, and basically how secure it is. And then obviously please come and talk to us, but I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well, talk to their supplier, whoever their supplier may be, but to check that they're
us on behalf of all the other suppliers.
Yes, but
us.
I think it's a good point to check that they're on board with the changes as well. That would be due diligence.
That would be my primary advice to start, and then try and get it under control and get a single view of what you've got. And then the guidance will be coming through in reams, I should think, and you can start applying it.
Imogen?
I think for me, it's obviously everything that Chris said, but it's that recognition of this is a whole organisational issue. So talk to each other within your organisation, talk to your leaders, talk to every department, every person you can, to make sure that people are aware of this and how it's going to impact on what they do, and talk to each other for that sense of support and peer learning as well. So I think don't feel like you're alone. There's lots of support and guidance out there, whether it's from the ICO or from your suppliers or from other authorities. So talk to each other, spread the word, and support each other.
David, what's your advice?
All of the above, but have a plan. Be working on it. At least you might not be ready by May next year, but as long as you're on that journey and you know where you're going, I think that's really important.
Is that fair to say that even if they're not quite ready, if they're showing due diligence and they're on the plan, is that good enough, or do they need to be fully 100% ready by 25th of May?
Well, the law says that compliance is required on the 25th of May 2018, so really good to hear of those people who think they're ready already.
That's brilliant.
So that's the law. In terms of our enforcement, we're a proportionate regulator. We would hope to continue to do so, and we would always look at what steps organisations have been taking to comply, and then we'd look at what the risk was. So it's about identifying perhaps if you're struggling, identify your biggest areas of risk. But yeah, full compliance is legally required by 25th of May 2018.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining me. Chris, Imogen, David, Victoria, thank you for joining me for a very interesting conversation. I have no doubt that we will be talking again before the 25th of May as things progress. And our advice, I guess, is yes, look out for the information from the horse's mouth is going to be from the ICO. That's where the fount of all decisions will come on that one, and keep an eye on progress. In the meantime, I guess it's up to all of us to try and engage senior chief execs and members with the fact that this matters and this is a whole organisational change and culture change issue. So we'll play our part in that. Thank you for joining us online. I hope you've enjoyed it. I just wanted to mention as well that actually, Civica, you've got a practical webcast on the 12th of July, I think, looking at some of the technical aspects around GDPR.
We've got a couple of my technical specialists on going through in great detail. I think there are still spaces available for it.
We'll make the link available after we close. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope you'll join us on the next edition. Thank you. Goodbye.